this is macroeconomics, and the first issue raised was the tragedy in Las Vegas, where a 64-year-old man in a motel room with numerous weapons has, so far that I heard, managed to kill over 50 people and injure over another 200. And I thought, when I heard a little bit of the broadcast, I thought I heard automatic rifle fire. Not semi-automatic, one shot at a time, but bursts of 5, 10, 20 rounds.
It's over 400 injured.
Over 400 injured now?
Yeah.
Anybody got an idea on how to solve that sort of problem? Or is that simply a part of what is going to happen?
You can't stop one person.
Gun control.
Would gun control stop that person?
Absolutely not.
I don't know. You know, you can argue that back when we had more stringent gun controls, we didn't have these kinds of instances. But to me, a lot of it is in the media. When other people see these things going on, they begin to think that, well, maybe this is something I want to do. And it's much more broadcast now than it was back then. And I don't think gun control is going to do much in that sense. But I also believe gun control could go a long ways further in, you know, ascertaining the ability, the sanity, whatever, the record of the people who are buying weapons.
But you don't need a gun to hurt a lot of people.
Nope, you can do it without a gun. You might have to be a little more creative.
I mean, like all over the world, like stuff's been happening right now, and it's been going on with cars just running over people.
Yep.
It's been bombs. It's not guns really. That's actually.
There were, what, 2 women killed in Marseille at the train station in France with a knife?
Yeah.
And that's, I'm guessing at the number, but I want to say that over the last couple of years, that's well over 200 people in France killed by terrorists. But of course, this fellow in Las Vegas was not a foreign terrorist. He was an American, from what I understand. So, don't know what the answer is.
Well, they were talking about it and saying that they're not sure how he would have gotten those guns anyways, because you have to have certain permits and a whole bunch of loopholes. So, I mean, the argument is you can regulate something and restrict something as much as you want, but if you want to get a hold of something bad enough, there's always going to be a way.
Yeah. Let me introduce you to some economics for a moment. We talk about in economics, things happen at the margin. At the margin. Margin or marginal means change. For example, if I look at my classes, there are some students who are going to make A's, almost regardless of what I try to do to them. And there are some students that are going to make F's, no matter how hard I try. They put the effort in, whatever else. They're very able. They have a lot of problems. They have a lot of distractions. They have very little discipline. I don't know. But if this is the distribution of students in my class, who should I teach to? Should I teach to the A student? Should I try to teach to the F student? Is that door still open? I'm going to go ahead and close that. It's a little distracting. What I tend to do is look at the folks in the middle, or maybe weighted a little bit this way, and I call that the marginal student. That's the student who's going to marginally barely pass if I just leave them alone. And I want to try to bring that person, or maybe the D student, up and improve their performance. I'll do what I can with these folks, but in my experience, for a lot of them, there's not much I can do that's going to motivate them. And there's not much I can do that's going to slow these folks down. So I tend to focus on what I term the marginal student. And that doesn't mean I lower my standards. It means I try to pull them up to those standards to be making a B in the course at least. And a lot of that is a function of self-confidence and self-image. How do you see yourself? When we talk about guns, there are people who are going to own guns and kill people. And there are people who will never own guns and find them abhorrent. But there's a whole spectrum out there. And somewhere in here is the marginal gun owner or shooter or whatever you want to call them. And that's who you're going to be able to change. That's just like if we're looking at Republicans and Democrats. Let's put the Republicans on the right and Democrats. What do we call it if I ask you, are you a Republican or a Democrat? What do we call that?
False dichotomy.
A false dichotomy. I said, are you this or that? Implying those are the only two choices. A dichotomy, but it's false. You can be somewhere in the middle. So if I want to persuade you to become a Republican, who am I going to talk to? I'm going to talk to the people in the middle. These folks are never going to change. But these people can be persuaded or influenced or whatever. So when we talk about gun control, for example, we know gun control isn't going to do any good against the people out on the far extreme. But is it going to affect a few people in the middle who might have been considering the use of a gun for a violent purpose? That's the only people I can hope to affect. And so I need to design my message, my media, aimed at this person, not that person, not that person. That's where persuasion takes place, with people undecided or in the middle, who vacillate back and forth. Other comments? Gun control, firearms, violence, terrorism, or anything more mundane? Y'all are boring as hell. You got nothing going on? Anybody going to the LSU game this weekend? I just got tickets to the game. I haven't been to a Gators game since, it's been at least 35 years.
Dang.
Dude, you missed a good one like 2 weeks ago.
I'll watch them on TV usually. If I watch any sports at all on TV, it's usually either the Gators football or Little League World Series in the summer, because I played Little League and enjoyed it. So I'm kind of excited about going to see the Gators and LSU next weekend.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess this year's going to be all right. Because LSU sucks. They just lost to Troy.
Well, that's okay. My query to the fellow I got the tickets from is, what do I do about parking?
Uber.
Huh?
Uber. It's like $20 though.
Yeah, it's really expensive.
It's like a flat rate of 13.
Is it?
Like,
Yeah.
And then your fare on top. It's how long it takes to get there.
$20 plus mileage or something? Or?
Yeah.
Really?
They were doing
Not bad.
this past Saturday, they were doing these like little shuttle things that
From where?
from like where Shamcare is. That's
Mhm.
where we parked, and then you just walk to one of their points, and then that one was like by tips, so you just tip them.
I understand that the shuttle comes from the Oaks Mall too. Yeah. So we haven't quite decided. The fellow I got them from, he said, basically get there 3 hours early. Live with it. Walk around, watch all the people in the tailgate parties, and have a good laugh. Take a few pictures. And probably,
Pictures?
well, yeah, a few of those too. Yeah. Okay, that'll be fun.
Come on out.
Well, I'm just looking forward to it, rain or no rain. What else on your mind? Anything at all? Last chance before we talk economics and bore you silly.
What do you think about the situation in Puerto Rico where that what was her name? She just came out with a pleading for.
You're talking about the mayor?
Yeah, she came out
Oh, I
and
thought Trump's comments about the mayor were absolutely inappropriate.
Wow, yeah. It was ridiculous.
But I saw somewhere a post about all of the military assets that have been committed to Puerto Rico. It was a rather lengthy list. It included, for example, 5 engineer battalions. Now, a battalion of engineers, I'm guessing, is somewhere around 500 soldiers. So that's a lot of help going down there. But I wonder, A, is that true? And B, when were they sent? Because it seems to me that Puerto Rico's gone through several days of disaster without much getting there.
with that, my old squadron from when I was in the military,
Yeah.
they just dispatched 2 helicopters over there. Like they're just on their way
Just on their way.
yesterday. So,
So
it's
it-
like they've been there needing help for
Yeah.
how long now?
Well, that's
Or
what I was gonna
just
say.
now?
Are we-
Yeah.
It seems to me that whatever assistance we're sending them has been very,
There was some type of
Laggard.
war that got, there were some supplies already sitting there that couldn't be moved though because of there was some issue, but there was just tons and tons of, I guess semis or whatever just sitting
they
there.
couldn't move.
Yeah, that couldn't be moved somehow.
Do you remember Hurricane Katrina in New
Yeah.
Orleans?
It was something like that.
Yeah, the truck drivers went on strike.
Say again?
The truck drivers went on strike.
Truck drivers went on strike.
They thought this was a good opportunity to do that.
Wow. We got a solution for that too. The Katrina response in New Orleans was a disaster. And who was president at that time? Bush the Lesser, Bush the Younger. Okay? And he caught hell for that. I'm waiting to see how much hell Trump catches for the treatment of the folks in Puerto Rico. Because I think the response has been abysmal, just atrocious.
I just think he's busy tweeting about the NFL.
Yeah, he's too busy tweeting about the NFL and the mayor of, is it the mayor of San Juan? Or,
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, another black mark on our record.
Things are getting pretty crazy just around the world, right?
Huh?
Things are getting pretty heated just across the world.
One of the things that seems to be going on across the world is as economies have done well for 30 years in the general sense of things, booming economies don't necessarily translate out to everybody, okay? Just because the pie got bigger, a lot of folks share the pie didn't. Now, what's caused this? Well, one of the things, international trade and moving companies abroad where labor was cheaper. Technology coming along and displacing people, losing their jobs, can't get hired, or if they get hired, it's at a much lower wage job. And this has caused an awful lot of dissatisfaction, particularly among lower income people in developed countries. That's France, Germany, Italy, somewhat the Scandinavian countries, very definitely the United States. And in a sense, this is part and parcel of capitalism. As the economy grows, we have what a guy named Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Does it sound like an oxymoron? Two words that contradict each other? Creative destruction. It is the destruction of some jobs and some industries while others emerge and grow. And so translating yourself from being this kind of employee to being that kind of employee, you may not have the skills to do that. What do we call that if your skills don't translate into a new job but you lost your old job? We call that structural unemployment. This has become more widespread, and the unhappiness and angst of that working class has provided a very fertile ground for people who would manipulate it, who would use it to their own advantage. And so we've seen it happen in the United Kingdom with Brexit. They're getting out of the European Union. And we saw it happen with Trump. What kind of people, for the most part, were pro-Trump? What was his message?
Like marginalized.
People who were marginalized, people who were, sort of making it, and then suddenly they're not making it. And what is coming out of this now in more and more places is a sense of nationalism. Let's take care of our own country. Let's take care of our own workers. This tends to be very anti-immigrant. And beyond that, it takes different forms, but it's protect our own. And the problem with that, because we have seen it through history, if you study any history, when this sort of nationalism begins to rise, international trade gets threatened because we suddenly put in tariffs on our goods or on foreign goods. So Americans can't afford to buy Japanese products or German products, etc. We want to force them to buy American products. And then what do the Italians and the Japanese and the Germans do? They put a tariff on our goods going into their country. And so they lose exports, we lose jobs. You and I find we can't afford to buy a nice Samsung TV. We got to buy an American-made one that maybe isn't as good or maybe is probably more expensive. And as international trade breaks down and jobs are lost, you have nations whose boundaries and borders, if you will, become more firm, and it becomes no longer a system of cooperation and trade and everybody growing. It becomes, I'm taking care of mine, don't screw with it or I'll get you. This is what leads to wars. What I've just described is exactly what happened with Adolf Hitler and Nazis. We destroyed Germany in World War II, in World War I, and then in the Treaty of Versailles, we refused to let them rebuild. We made them keep paying reparations for the war, paying people back for all the expenses. They couldn't reestablish their economy. Their economy was devastated until Hitler comes along and says, we're better people than this, and I will lead you into a better future. And it was easy for people to buy into that. Now, where he led them was a travesty, but when you take people who are worried, who are marginalized, who have lost jobs, who see their children with no future, who see their educational systems breaking down, it's not hard to put enough fear into them to get them to follow you. That's what I see going on around the world today. Sir, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, regarding like really large natural disasters and like the mass shooting that happened this morning.
Yeah.
Is there anything that like the average American citizen can do to help besides donate money? Because I know that like you can donate money to foundations who are helping out, but is there? I always hear people saying they want to help out, and I'm like, yeah, me too, but what do I do?
You know, you can travel out there and see if they're taking on volunteers to do stuff. You can find different agencies that are collecting different goods or money, and you can donate in that way. In the immediate sense, I think that's pretty much it. In the longer run, you can begin asking questions of yourself and your friends. What caused this? What led to this? In some cases, we ask, who benefited from this? And we start then, hopefully, communicating better about the ways we can go about preventing this from happening. I'll tell you the truth about me personally. I'm on Facebook usually every day or every 2 days, and I am constantly posting stuff about things I think that are going wrong in this country. Not because I think I'm going to change anybody with a single post, but because those marginal people who are undecided about an issue, I want to continue to remind them about this and think about it this way. That's a much longer strategic attack, if you will. Absent those things, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. And I try not to bring my own personal political opinions into class, but occasionally I will, just so we can talk about it and get some kind of conversation going. Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask if you were around,
I've been around since dirt.
Okay. So I was just going to ask, so back when the Vietnam War and everything was going on, and there was a bunch of protests, and there seemed to be a lot of conflict and stuff. I was just wondering if you think it's different now, if it's more intense, or if it was more intense then, or just things of that nature.
I think the political discord we have today is more polarizing. That Democrats hate Republicans and Republicans hate Democrats, and they're not working together. I think what happened in Vietnam was, in the first place, we got into a war then, much as we did in Iraq. We got into a war based on lies that were told to us by our leaders. They told us those lies to get us into the war because they felt we needed to fight that enemy. If you read about the Vietnam War, there's something called the Tonkin Gulf messages and deception, where we were told that we'd been attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats, and in fact, in retrospect, it didn't happen. But we then, from that attack, began to escalate military action, began to do more active support for the South Vietnamese, and eventually in '65 sent in troops. Now what happened was, when we decided to go to war, we needed a lot bigger military, because our standing army after World War II, like it does after every war, shrank. But when we started gearing up and decided we were going to send division-sized units to South Vietnam, we needed a lot more soldiers. And so we began to draft. We were already drafting. But when you got a small army, you don't have to draft too many people. And if you went into the draft, the worst case was you did a couple of years, you got out, No big deal. Suddenly it's Vietnam. And now we're drafting a whole lot more people. Well, here's one of the decisions. Who should we draft? Well, we're going to take young men between 18 and 26 years old. Sound okay? Most physically fit. And then somebody said, yeah, but what about the young men who are in college with promising careers, who are going to be our future leaders and highly productive citizens? Why don't we let them have an exemption so they can finish their college and then be drafted? And everybody went, oh yeah, that's good. That's a good idea. Well, what does that do for the person who's not going to college? And when you began to look at who was being drafted into the U.S. Army and then sit to a war, and a war that you would sit down in the evening and watch it on fairly new color TV and watch American bodies being put in body bags. Suddenly this war began to strike home. It was affecting a lot more families. It was being communicated in a much more graphic way. And then slowly, we sent troops in 65. By 68, the protests are huge. But why was the protest? The protest was, why are you only sending low-income, uneducated young males, predominantly, maybe not predominantly, but largely minorities? Why are they over there fighting this war for the rest of us who are sitting at home watching it on TV, drinking a beer? And when that began to affect more and more families, that draft, the opposition to the war began to rise. People began to ask, why are we there? How do we know we're winning? And the military solution was, we'll tell you how we're winning because we'll do a body count. We'll count how many Vietnamese, North Vietnamese we kill. Well, you can kill all of them you want, but they keep coming. That didn't do it. You can't take territory and hold it because you don't have that many soldiers, so you win a hill and then you'd withdraw for it and they're back there the next day. So we can't measure that we're being successful. We can absolutely measure every night how many Americans are being killed. We know that it's affecting families across the spectrum, and so the resistance to that grew. And then Nixon finally was smart enough to say, we can't keep doing this. It was a polarizing thing, but to me, it was huge swaths of middle and lower class America saying no more. Today, we see a split. And I'm not sure how the split goes. I'm not sure where the middle class is. Is the middle class more Republican or is it more Democrat? I don't know. But I see the split today is very, very hyper, very angry. I can remember sitting in Matherly Hall, which at the time was the College of Business at the University of Florida. And of course, we were draft exempt. We were students. We were going to get our business degree, and we were going to, if the war didn't take us, we were going to go out and start careers and make money. And about that time, a guy came running down the hallway saying, we're having a war protest march right here on University Avenue. Come on out. Everybody join us. And he was going into the classrooms. Nobody stood up and walked out for the protest. Instead, it was, hey, I'm here for my education. I paid this. I need to get my degree. Now, that was probably 66, 67. Later on, you got more and more people going out. It was a very divisive time. A civil war in its way, just as much as we have kind of a civil war today. I don't know how you tell the players, but you have the pro-Trump conservative Republicans, and then you have the other folks who are opposed to their policies. Very divisive. All right, didn't mean to ramble. Other questions? Today we start that part of this course that to me is the most interesting. And in fact, it relates to what we've talked about the polarization of our country into two different groups. And you can define them in different ways, but for our purposes, I'm going to talk about the group who feels that government has done good, that government has corrected many problems, that government is the solution to many problems. And the other group that says government always screws it up, government has done harm, government takes your taxes and therefore your economic freedom, and we need less government, okay? We're going to attack that entire concept beginning today in terms of economics. We're going to define two different schools of economics, the classical school, and then over here, the Keynesian school. And I have asked you to read a PDF that's on Canvas. It's called Economic Models and Methods or something like that. It's a PDF. It's not a doc, DOC or DOCX. It's an extract from my book. And it's kind of a summary of the things we're going to talk about for the next 4 chapters. And again, if you will read that first and slowly, and then begin the textbook will come together, I think, a little better. What I'm going to talk about in class comes primarily from that PDF. But it's an explanation of what is classical economics and what is Keynesian economics. Now, in today's contemporary terminology, this is sometimes called neoclassical, and particularly in Europe, classical is called liberal, and they call it neoliberal economics. Not liberal in the sense you and I use it, though. Okay? When we talk about liberals in the United States, they're usually on the left side of the spectrum. So these would be primarily the folks thinking in the Democratic Party, and these would be primarily the folks in the Republican Party. And so what we want to do, what I want you to do in this course, is understand the economic rationale behind the 2 viewpoints. To do that, we have to go back to something I'm calling the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And it's this graph that we use to explain stuff, and you will see this graph numerous times in class and on the exam. The graph shows the price level on the vertical axis. The price level indicates whether inflation is occurring. If you go further and further up the axis, you have rising prices, you have inflation. The horizontal axis represents real GDP, not nominal, real. Which means the further out the right axis you go, the bigger the economy gets. The more it is producing, and the more jobs there are. So in a quasi manner, this axis also talks about the unemployment rate. Except that the further out you go, the smaller the unemployment rate, because there's more people working. Unemployment gets smaller when the economy grows. And those 3 measures are what we're going to typically focus on in macro. We're going to focus on inflation, output or GDP, and unemployment. And so we can show more or less what's going on with those things with one graph. And it behooves you to be able to look at the graph and understand what it's telling you. And I will slow down for a minute because some of you are taking notes and I don't want to get too far ahead. Any comments or questions so far? Yes. On this graph, we are going to have a demand curve, which we will call the aggregate demand curve. That is the totality of spending in our economy. And that spending has 4 elements. Consumption spending by households, investment spending by businesses, government spending at all levels, and net exports to our trading partners internationally. Total spending. And it says when prices get lower, we buy more stuff. We spend more money. What else happens? As you move down the demand curve, what happens to unemployment? It gets smaller. You grow in the size of the economy. So this is where the graph always starts. Where we get into some differences up here is in the way we draw the supply curve. We're going to have an aggregate supply curve. And the shape of the aggregate supply curve is going to be your key to which kind of system you're talking about. Okay? With respect to the horizontal axis, total output, total GDP. Listen careful. At any one point in time, there is a maximum level of output. That would be like being on the production possibilities curve. That's as much as you can produce. That level of output, which I will pick arbitrarily, I will call QFE. Full employment, real GDP, full employment output. That would equate, we think more or less, to around a 5% unemployment rate, normally. Okay so far? So let's kind of wade into the shallow water on the classical school. Here's what happens with the classical school. When we draw the aggregate supply curve to explain their arguments, the aggregate supply curve is a vertical line at full employment output. A vertical, perfectly inelastic aggregate supply curve at full employment. The why behind that is this stuff you really got to understand. We'll get there, but look at the equilibrium. Here is the equilibrium in the economy, which translates to a price level, let's call it of 100 or 1.00 base year, and full employment. In the view of the classical arguments, this is where the economy normally resides, at full employment. We say it this way. The economy always adjusts to full employment. In other words, as a natural course of events, unemployment should not be a problem in an economy. And we want to understand why they say that. And to understand that, we need to show in their terms what happens, for example, if the economy goes into a recession. What happens if you and I stop spending money and businesses stop spending money and governments shrink and stop spending money? What happens? What would happen on our graph if there is a decline in spending? Aggregate demand is going to shift to the left. So watch carefully. The aggregate demand curve, let's say, shifts over here. I was never good with crayons. I'm not any better with these damn markers, okay? The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. We go from an equilibrium at point A to a new level of spending at point B. Point B is not an equilibrium. Equilibrium means, oh, it's pretty stable. This is not stable. We're not going to stay here. But look what's going on to the level of spending. We used to buy $12 trillion worth of stuff. Now we're only buying $5 trillion worth of stuff. Spending has collapsed. If you were a business in this economy, what would be going on at point B? How would business be? Sir? It would be terrible. You got no customers.
You probably have to let go some of your employees.
Your first response is going to be, I've got to start letting go some employees. Why don't you drop your prices?
Profit's going to go down.
Well, it'll threaten your profits. And remember, if you're selling an inventory, you bought it at this price. If you drop your price far enough, you're going to be losing money on everything you sell. But it's worse than that. If you drop your price and you do manage to pick up a few more customers, what is your competition going to do? They're going to do the same thing, and you're going to get yourself into a downward spiral of prices and a price war. Nobody's going to win. So you're very, very hesitant to drop price at first, so what do? You cut costs. Now, remember, this is designed some time ago. It's designed at a time when most businesses were labor intensive. Okay, they had a lot of workers, and labor was a major cost. Not like Silicon Valley today, where relatively few people are generating one hell of a lot of money. No, these were factories, farms, etc. The argument by the classical people, though, is this. This is where it starts. 1, aggregate demand takes a huge decline. We have a recession. Why did it decline? I don't know. We'll figure that out later. Maybe the stock market crash, okay? But as a result of this, too, sales for businesses take a major drop. And as a result of that, they lay off a lot of workers. When every business is laying off workers, what happens to the unemployment rate? Remember, you're down here at point B. The unemployment rate down here is not 5%, let's let it be 13%. So when everybody starts laying off workers, I wonder if I'm still on the board. Just bear with me. Let's make a slight adjustment here. We're going to say the unemployment rate rises. And here's where the adjustment starts, the little star bank. Here's how the economy is going to move back to full employment by itself. Nobody's directing it. As you lay off your workers, you have reduced your costs. Okay, so far? So your costs are down, and as a result, I don't want to say it quite that way. Let me do a little better. You got all these people out there with no jobs. You've fired half of your workforce. Your workforce is working for you for $10 an hour. You fired half of them. What do you say to the other half?
Take up the pay.
Who wants a pay cut? I'm going to cut wages. Who's wanting to take a pay cut? Because if you don't want to take a pay cut, what? Don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out. You're fired. When there's a surplus of labor, just like a surplus of anything else, its prices fall. Whether it's gasoline, booze, whatever, the price of labor is going to fall. So unemployment is going to cause wages to fall. That's the first step in the adjustment process. With all of these people unemployed, I can now not only have cut my workforce, but I've cut the wages I'm paying the few people I have left, because that's the only way they can keep a job. And I'm not necessarily an evil person for doing this, I'm just trying to survive. Once I've cut my wages, this means my costs are lower. And so the explanation goes, now I can reduce my prices. And this is the second step in the adjustment process. I didn't want to cut my prices earlier for fear of a price war, but now that I've got my costs down, I can afford to take a lower price and maintain my profit margins. As I reduce my prices, what will happen to my sales? My sales will begin to increase. As my sales increase, what will I need to do?
Hire more employees.
I need to go back and hire more workers, hire more labor. Do I have to pay them a higher wage? Hell no, they haven't got a job now. As I hire more workers, not just me, but every business in the nation, as we put more people to work, what happens to spending? Spending increases, and this becomes a virtual and virtuous circle. As people spend more, I need to produce more. As I produce more, I create more jobs. People make more money, they spend more, and it repeats itself. And what happens? Look at the graph now. What happens is you go from B down the demand curve to C. Lower prices, more spending, more jobs. You're back at point C. How is point C? Perfect. We got everybody back to work. You see how this is working? This is the way markets are supposed to work. Okay? This is the classical argument on why, when the economy goes into a recession or a depression, a really bad recession, it will fix itself, the term we frequently use. The economy always self-corrects back to full employment. What was the role of the government in making this happen? None. We don't need the government to manage the economy. It will fix itself. I think this is logically appealing, intuitively, appealing. It is fairly easy, fairly elegant, logical. And so for 150 years, we believe that. And so, in 1929, the stock market collapses. The aggregate demand curve shifts way inside. And by 1930, have we self-corrected? No. By 1931, have we self-corrected? No. By 1932, have we self-corrected? No. And by 1933, the unemployment rate has gradually escalated up to 25%, and people are beginning to ask, when does this correction kick in, please? I'd like my job back, please. When can I expect that? Okay? And you're looking at both social and economic devastation across the country. Families coming apart, suicide rates going crazy, people living in unspeakable poverty. And our policymakers in Washington, Herbert Hoover and his crowd, classical economic advisors, are saying, patience, patience, it's going to fix itself. Here, Herb, put your feet up. Let me get you a beer, Mr. President. It's going to fix itself. Well, by 1932 in November, it didn't fix itself, and people were angry enough that they voted Hoover out and they voted Franklin Roosevelt in. And with Franklin Roosevelt, we see an entirely new approach to dealing with this depression. And the approach is government can do some good here. And so Roosevelt creates the New Deal. I got a New Deal for Americans. And he basically creates government agencies which create government jobs and puts people back to work that way. We already talked once in here about the Civilian Conservation Corps. Remember that?
Yep.
Yeah. The Works Progress Administration, numerous agencies, the National Recovery Act. We put people back to work, even if it was doing nothing but going out and raking leaves in the park. Go to work, I'll give you a check. I'll give you a paycheck. I'll give you a salary. And as that money began to flow in, spending began to increase. And indeed, we began to move from here, hesitatingly, aggregate demand began to shift back out. Prices weren't necessarily falling, but there was more spending going on. We did that from 1933 until 1937. The Depression was getting better. Unemployment rates were falling. There's just one little problem with this solution. Want to take a guess at what it might be?
Costs a lot of money.
Where does Uncle Sam get all that money he's paying all these workers with? The answer was he borrowed it. Who'd he borrow it from? Mostly Americans. They came down to you in your schools or in your jobs and said, you want to buy some bonds, some U.S. bonds. And people began to buy the bonds, which is a way of loaning the government money, and they would repay it later. The trouble with that is the government, in borrowing all this money, went very, very deeply into debt. And you have to understand the traditional, old-fashioned, classical view of debt. Debt is a bad thing. It's bad for you as an individual, and it's bad for us as a nation. It's simply an indicator of very poor fiscal management. If you as a young man had wanted to date my daughter back in 1921, and let's say that she's 18 years old and you're 19, 20, 21, you got a job, you're working. As soon as she mentioned your name, the first thing I'm going to do is say, why don't you ask that young gentleman over to have lunch with us Sunday? And when you show up and my daughter introduces you to me, and I put down the handgun that I'm cleaning, my first question to you is going to be, well, hello, Joe, it's a pleasure to meet you. Where do you work? I want to know what kind of job you got. I want to know what kind of money you're making, and then I want to know how well you're managing it. I see you're driving a fairly new car out there. You making that kind of money, be able to afford a car like that, and then you screw up. And you say, no, I took out a loan at the bank. What am I thinking? Poor fiscal management, poor money management. You're a spendthrift. You're already spending more money than you're making. And you want to go out with my daughter? Let me put this gun back together again, okay? Because you do not spend more money than you make. That is an indicator of immaturity, lack of discipline, total irresponsibility. And if that's true for the individual, it's damn sure true for us as a country. So here's Roosevelt, 1933, 34, 35. The debt's getting bigger, and people are looking at Roosevelt saying, these people are out of control. They're spending us into poverty as a nation. So in 1937, we stopped all that spending and tried to pay some of it off, tried to balance the budget. And as a result, we went right back into another depression. And how long did that second phase of the depression last? When did the depression end? How did the depression end?
Get ourselves into a war.
On September the 1st, in 1939, Germany invades Poland. And the United States looks over there and sees Great Britain, which has agreed to help defend Poland and Belgium and wherever. They're in a war. And we're looking at it in the United States saying, damn, I'm glad I'm not in that war. We're going to be neutral. And we tried to stay neutral until December the 7th, 1941. What happened on December the 7th, 41? The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, complete surprise, at least to just about everybody. And bingo, we found ourselves in a war. Now, between 39 and 41, we had been rebuilding our military somewhat. But on December the 7th, 41, it was, here we go, full bore. We're going to grow. We're going to build up the military. We're going to produce more missiles, well, not missiles back then, but tanks, jeeps, trucks, artillery pieces. And so as we began to increase this production, hey, where did we get the money? We borrowed the hell out of it. Was anybody worried about us borrowing a lot of money then? No, this is an emergency. So we borrow the hell out of money. We go hugely into debt for World War II, but we create jobs in two different categories. The military, all the young men who are drafted and sent to war, and then in the civilian sector, what happened? A lot of the women took over the jobs on the factory lines. We called Rosie the Riveter was our image for that. With everybody working like that, everybody making more money, the economy is recovering. So occasionally you'll hear people talk about, well, what we need to recover this economy is a good war. Well, that's called stupid. There's no such thing as a good war. Okay? But that's how we get out of this depression, and that's how we see the aggregate demand curve move back out. Okay, you with me so far? I'm going to go through that again with a little different perspective, but for right now, let's take this sequence of events and say to ourselves, what did Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, he publishes a book in 1936, 4 years after Roosevelt is elected, and he basically takes this classical view and says, here is what is wrong. His book is called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. 1936, The General Theory. And in it, he basically takes apart the classical arguments. This is what I refer to in my writings as the refutation. To refute, to argue that something is wrong. Keynes's refutation of the classical arguments. I want you to know these comfortably. The refutation starts right here. Think about what the classical argument said. When you get all these people unemployed, we'll be able to cut their wages and their wages will fall. That's absolute true. It's going to happen. My question is, how long do you think it would take to happen? How long would it take you to cut the wages on your workers? Let's say they're making $10 an hour, now you're going to cut them to $5. You going to do that overnight? What happens when you come into your workforce one morning and say, hey, I'm cutting everybody's wages by 50%? What do you think they do?
They quit.
They either quit or they look at you and say, look, boss, you fired 50% of your workforce, and we know which 50% you kept, remember? Which ones did you keep?
The good ones.
The best ones. We are your business. You start talking about cutting our wages by 50%, we're walking. And you will not have a low-cost business, you'll have a no-cost business because you won't have a damn business. Would that incentivize you to join a union? Oh, hell yes. And so what are you going to do instead? You're the business owner. You're probably going to come in and say, sit down, folks, we got to talk. I need to cut costs, and I'm going to ask you to take a small pay cut while we try to make things better. I'm going to cut your wages from $10 to $9. What are you going to say to that? Why? Because we can't keep going like we're doing. We're losing money. If we keep going the way we're going, we'll all be out of business here in another year. And so we have some debate and some back and forth. And maybe I get you to take a $1 pay cut. But is that going to save the business? Not really. And so we go through this again and again. And my point is this. Yes, wages will fall, but only very slowly. Remember? 1933, 1934, 1935. Only very slowly. Keynes' term, wages are sticky down. Wages are sticky down. Sticky down means they stick a lot when they're trying to fall. They won't fall very far or very fast. So what does that mean about your depression? It means it's not going away in a hurry. Okay, so far? Problem number 2, right here. Prices. Even if you got everybody to take $5 an hour, you really cut your costs. How fast do you want to start cutting your prices? Slowly, because the more I cut my price, the more profit I lose. And if I cut my prices too far too fast, what's my competition going to do?
Same.
They're going to match your prices. And the next thing you know, you've all cut your prices. Is that going to bring in any more sales? No. So again, prices are also sticky down. They only fall a little bit slowly. But we're not done yet. Let's go back to before the Depression. You were paying your workers, we'll make it a little more realistic, you were paying your workers $2 an hour. And at that time, a loaf of bread, let's say a loaf of bread cost 50 cents. Now, we have cut your wages and we have cut prices. We've cut your wages to $1 and we've cut the price of bread to 25 cents. Can you afford to buy more bread? Right here, a loaf of bread costs you 15 minutes of work, one fourth of your wage. You see that? 50 cents is 1/4 of $2 an hour. You had to work 15 minutes to buy 50 cents worth of bread. Now what? Same thing. It takes 25 cents out of your hourly wage, 1/4 of your wage. Are you buying more bread or anything else? No. Your purchasing power has not increased. So how are you going to be putting more people back to work? How are you going to be selling more bread or anything else? You're not. This is what Keynes explains, and we sometimes explain it using the term, this is the fallacy of composition. Let me explain that term. The fallacy of composition. If just you and your business were able to cut wages 50% and then cut prices while everybody else stayed at the same wage level, they could buy a lot more of your stuff. Do you see that? So this works. This whole thing about wages and prices, it works for one company if it's the only company that does that while the rest of the economy stays healthy. So this is true for a single company. But when every company cuts wages and prices, it doesn't work. The fallacy of composition means what's true for one is not necessarily true for everybody at the same time. And I think that's a beautiful insight into this model, which seems so logical, seems so elegant, so explanatory, until you take one more step into it and say, well, what if everybody's got lower wages? Your lower prices aren't going to do you much good. Okay, so far? I'm going to leave classical Keynes right there for today. I want you to read through that PDF, but I want to try to emphasize to you, at least for the 50 years since I took my first economics course. At least for 50 years, we have been teaching that this is the way markets work. And while there was a resurgence in the Keynesian view in the 50s and the 60s, it declined, and this became the dominant view again, beginning in the 70s and particularly in the 80s and 90s and today. There are more economists, including teaching economists out there, who believe in this classical view than there are those who believe in the Keynesian view. Sir?
What happened during that 2007, 2008, 2009 thing, the recession?
To me, 1980 is a good year to look at, but one of the preeminent spokesmen for classical free market, no government economics, one of the preeminent spokesmen was a guy by the name of Milton Friedman. Dr. Milton Friedman. He wrote a book called Free to Choose, which, if you're going to ever say anything about economics, you ought to read that book. It's really short and sweet. It's just examples of how government screws stuff up. Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976. So you're seeing sort of the rising, almost zenith of classical economics again. And beginning with Ronald Reagan in 1980, you saw the United States move its policy much more in the direction of we need to cut government, Reagan's term. We need to get government off the backs of people. We need to get government to stop taking all your money. And that's an easy thing to sell to people, isn't it? Damn, I'd love to have a tax cut. And so beginning, I'm going to say 76 to 80, somewhere in there, you saw the beginning of the resurrection, if you will, of this phoenix called classical economics. And it has held the forefront since 1980. So how long is that? 37 years. Okay? What we are now beginning to see in the literature and in the discussions among economists, macroeconomists in particular, is this whole classical model is very powerful, but it is not as clean and simple as people would like to think that it is. That while markets do work, they work slowly and sometimes unpredictably. Sometimes there are side effects to them you didn't anticipate. And so we are in the very early stages today of finally revising the way we're going to teach economics for the next 30 or 40 years. And in part of that, we are saying, let's look at the way the world really is, and let's look at this and see what of it is good and useful, and what of it is either deceptive or harmful. And so we're beginning to, if you will, the pendulum on a clock. Strong classical economics until the Great Depression, strong Keynesianism until 1980, strong classical economics since 1980, and the pendulum is slowly now beginning to change again. And I don't mean to imply by any means that Keynes had all the answers. We'll see that there's some difficulties there too. But for the last 35 years, in conversations with people outside the classroom who have bachelor's degrees and more, in business and have taken economics, I've had them tell me how great markets were and try to explain how they work. And in every case, I've given them this example. And I've taken them right up to the point of, okay, we're supposed to get out of a depression this way. You remember that? And they'll go, yeah, I think so, yeah. Well, why didn't that work? Why did it take from 1933 until 1941 for us to get out of that depression? And pretty much the conversation breaks down. And pretty much they stop buying me drinks. And pretty much I don't have any friends anymore. So you're going to get a dose of what I want to call reality. Reality is these are theories. There are things we can learn from them. They help to explain, but they are not the whole picture of what we need to be doing. So I want you to understand the theory and be able to explain it and even defend it if you need to, but then I want you to know what are the shortcomings there too. What are the other difficulties? Okay? That's why to me, this is the most important part of this course. Because this theoretical background is what you will take forward as you start reading the news and listening to the politicians and listening to what they want to do. For example, Trump's tax cut. Trump and the Republicans want to institute a very, very large tax cut, most of which will go to the wealthy and to businesses. What is their reasoning for that? Their reasoning is if you give tax cuts to businesses, they will grow and create more jobs. We're going to talk about that. We've tried that several times. Okay? It didn't work, by the way. But I want you to look at the news and say, I understand this, or bring it to class and say, what the hell is this all about? Okay? What about immigrants? What about reducing the number of immigrants that comes to the United States? What are the economic reverberations that come from that? Any idea?
Immigrants do jobs that Americans won't.
They do jobs that Americans won't, at wages that Americans wouldn't accept. But we are also looking at a shortfall in our labor force into the future because baby boomers are dying out, and while you millennials number as great as we do, you are not having as many kids as we did. And so the labor pool, the labor force in the United States is not going to sustain itself just through normal reproduction. So maybe immigrants are something we need. This is what Germany saw. That's why so many Turkish citizens immigrated into Germany and were welcomed in the 70s and 80s. It's why Japan is in a terrible mess because the Japanese baby boomers didn't have many kids. Their kids aren't even marrying, much less having kids. And they're looking at, oh my God, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? You're not going to have any workers. That's what's going to happen. So this is the world you live in. This is what's going on. Understand some of the reasoning and the thinking behind it. Take a look at what's going on and bring it to class. Let's talk about it. Talk with some of your friends about it. You'll be amazed at some of their observations. It's very entertaining because they're simply not aware. Okay? When you see me on Wednesday, what are we going to talk about? The rest of this. Finish that damn PDF, okay? Peace.